Her breath grazed his skin, sweet as honey, deadly as venom. The blazing violet eyes of Queen Seraphine were mere centimeters from his, close enough to make any other man tremble. But him? He just smiled. Zithra had fallen. Warriors once proud now knelt in desperate longing, crushed not by force, but by a desire they couldn't resist. Yet amid the moans of submission, one stood tall, Logan Vance, a wanderer from Earth, unshaken, unbowed. Seraphine approached, her liquid metal armor clinging to every perfect curve, the light glinting off her alabaster skin like it was carved from marble. She whispered, her voice a caress against the mind. "Why don't you kneel?" He tilted his head, a lazy grin stretching across his lips. "Make me want to. A queen who cannot be denied. A mortal who cannot be tamed. When desire becomes a game of power, who will win? Who will break first? Don't miss what's next. Hit that subscribe button now and turn on the bell so you don't miss a single scorching, tense, and tantalizing moment." Zithra had once been a breathtaking marvel, a planet of crystalline beauty where towering spires stretched toward the heavens, their surfaces shimmering with a soft purple glow that pulsed like the breath of life itself. The air had carried a crisp, clean bite, and the ground sparkled underfoot, reflecting the stars in a mirror of ice and light. Now, it was a wasteland of devastation. The central crystal spire, Zithra's beating heart and proudest monument, lay in ruins, smashed to pieces by the iron will of the Etherean Empire. Jagged shards littered the frozen terrain, their edges glinting faintly in the dim light like the last flickers of a dying fire. The wind howled through the wreckage, carrying a thick, intoxicating scent. Pheromones, the Empire's signature weapon, a sweet, suffocating fog that didn't just conquer bodies but rewrote minds, drowning them in a haze of helpless desire. At the center of this shattered landscape stood Seraphine's throne, a pristine slab of crystal rising defiantly from the rubble, untouched by the chaos around it. It gleamed with an eerie, otherworldly beauty, its surface smooth and cold, a stark contrast to the broken world at its feet. She appeared atop it, her presence a quiet thunderclap that silenced the wind. The Etherean queen stepped forward, her movements fluid and deliberate, each motion radiating a power that needed no words. Her liquid metal armor clung to her like a second skin, silver shimmering as it flowed over her body, tracing every curve with meticulous precision. The armor hugged her impossibly narrow waist, flared out at her hips, and split subtly at her thighs, revealing long, sculpted legs that moved with a dancer's grace. Her violet eyes glowed, deep and piercing, twin pools of light that could unravel a man's soul with a glance. White hair cascaded down her back, catching the faint light like a veil of spun crystal, shifting with every breath she took. Seraphine wasn't just a ruler. She was a force of nature, a living embodiment of temptation forged by the Empire to break wills without ever raising a blade. Before her throne, the defeated Zithrans knelt in ragged rows, their once shining armor dented and dulled by battle. Their heads bowed, eyes glassy and unfocused, lips trembling with incoherent murmurs as the pheromones coiled around them like invisible chains. Men and women alike, warriors who'd once stood tall with swords raised, now groveled on the cold ground, their spirits crushed not by force but by an unrelenting wave of longing. The air was thick with their desperation, a chorus of soft moans and whispered pleas that hung like a fog. But amidst this sea of submission, one figure stood apart, untouched by the spell. Logan Vance, an earthborn wanderer, leaned casually against a fractured pillar, hands shoved deep in the pockets of his battered leather jacket. His green eyes, sharp and cool as cut jade, swept over the scene with a flicker of amusement, like he was watching a street performer who'd lost the crowd. The wind tugged at his tousled brown hair, giving him a wild, reckless edge that matched the lopsided smirk tugging at his lips. He locked eyes with Seraphine and drawled, "I've seen hotter stuff on Earth. This, kinda tame." Her head tilted slightly, Violet gazed narrowing as if he'd just thrown her a riddle instead of a jab. The prisoners around them stirred, a ripple of whispers breaking through their haze, shock, disbelief, a murmur of "Who is he?" But before she could respond, a wiry figure burst into view from behind the throne, skidding to a halt with a clatter of metal. Zelenki, her advisor, bounced forward, his silver tendrils of hair jingling like tiny bells, his oversized armor rattling with every frantic move. His voice cracked with manic excitement as he shouted, "My queen, let me deploy the ultimate seduction machine. He'll be begging at your feet in no time." His eyes gleamed, hands waving wildly like he was conducting some deranged symphony. Seraphine's lips tightened, a flash of memory cutting through her focus. Zelenki's last brilliant invention had turned her pheromone vault into a smoking crater, leaving half her soldiers tangled in a lust-fueled mess for hours. "Silence, Zelenki," she snapped, her tone sharp enough to cut glass, though her eyes never left Logan. She descended from the throne, each step a slow, deliberate rhythm that echoed faintly against the broken stone. The liquid armor shimmered under the dim light, molding to the gentle sway of her hips, outlining the lithe strength beneath her curves. The air grew heavier as she approached, the pheromones thickening into a cloying sweetness that pressed against the senses. The prisoner's moans rose in pitch, a pitiful symphony of surrender, but Logan stood firm, his green eyes tracking her every move, unshaken. She stopped a few feet away, close enough for him to catch her scent, not just the chemical haze that saturated the air, but something deeper, richer, a trace of her essence that cut through the artificial fog like a blade. She leaned in, her full red lips parting slightly, voice sliding out smooth as velvet. "Human, why don't you crave me?" Logan shrugged, that half-smile spreading wider across his face. "I've dodged worse temptations on crappier Mondays," he said, his tone light, but edged with steel, tossing her question back like it was a game he'd already won. Seraphine's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something new sparking inside her, curiosity laced with a hint of irritation. No one had ever resisted her like this, standing tall while her power washed over them like a tide. She stepped closer, erasing the distance, her body so near he could feel the heat radiating through the thin armor. Her slender fingers brushed his thigh, nails grazing the rough fabric of his pants in a slow, deliberate stroke that promised more than it delivered. "You will kneel," she murmured, her violet eyes flaring with a quiet, dangerous fire. He didn't budge. That smirk widened, green eyes dancing with mischief. "Nice try, but kneeling's not my style," he said. Then, quick as a heartbeat, he leaned forward, his right hand brushing the soft curve of her backside through the slick metal of her armor. It was a fleeting touch, bold but light, just enough to make her tense, violet eyes flashing wide in a rare jolt of surprise. The air between them thickened, humming with a heat that hadn't been there before, a silent spark that hung like a dare. The prisoners froze, their moans fading into stunned silence. Zelenki's jaw dropped, his tendrils quivering mid-jiggle. Logan chuckled low, a rough sound that rolled through the stillness. "You're not the only one who can play, sweetheart." Seraphine regained her composure in an instant, but a faint flush crept up her cheeks, a crack in her icy mask she couldn't hide. She stepped back, her gaze sharpening, though it wavered with something unsteady. "You're a strange one, human," she said, her voice catching just enough to hint at a storm beneath. Anger, intrigue, maybe both. Logan shrugged, hands sliding back into his pockets, acting like it was just another day on the job. But they both felt it. That moment had shifted the ground beneath them, threading a connection through the power play that neither could ignore. Zelenki, unable to stand the silence, leapt forward, his voice piercing the tension. "My queen, he touched you. Let me fix this. High-grade pheromone bomb." He fumbled a glowing orb from his coat, its surface pulsing with a faint blue light, but it slipped from his sweaty grasp, rolling across the ground before shattering with a soft pop. A dense, sugary cloud billowed out, heavier than the air before, curling around them like a lover's embrace. The prisoners groaned louder, some collapsing to the dirt, eyes rolling back in blissful surrender as the scent overwhelmed them. Seraphine coughed, stumbling as the wave hit her, her balance faltering, and she pitched forward, straight into Logan. His reflexes kicked in. He caught her, one strong hand landing firm on the curve of her hip, fingers pressing just below that slender waist. Through the thin armor, he felt the unexpected give of her body, soft where he'd expected steel, a contrast that sent a slow heat curling through him. Her chest pressed against his, her breath hitching as she steadied herself, and she looked up, violet eyes locking with his green ones, mere inches apart. Her breath brushed his face, warm and sweet, a mix of pheromones and something distinctly her, a scent that tugged at him, low and deep, stirring something he didn't bother naming. For a heartbeat, they were alone in that haze, her curves molded to his grip, her lips so close he could almost taste them. The world shrank to the space where their bodies met, a pull flaring sharp and undeniable, lingering in the silence. She whispered, voice soft, but she didn't pull away. Logan's smirk softened, his hand staying on her hip a beat longer, fingers brushing the curve before easing off. Careful, Queen. Don't make me catch you again, he teased, voice low and rough with a playful edge. She straightened, stepping back, but the flush on her cheeks deepened, her composure fraying at the edges. Her violet eyes glinted with a storm of emotions. Anger, curiosity, and maybe something dangerously close to want. Zelenki flailed nearby, a whirlwind of panic and noise. My queen, I'm sorry. I'll fix it. New plan, he yelped, tripping over a shard of crystal and sprawling face first into the dirt. Seraphine shot him a glare, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. Enough. Take him to the ship. I want to see what this human's made of. The guards moved in, their armor clanking as they flanked Logan, but he shrugged them off, falling in a step behind her without a fuss. That half-smile never faded, green eyes flicking to the sway of her hips as she led the way. The game was on, and he was ready to play it his way. The ethereal veil dominated the horizon above Zithra's shattered remains, a colossus of dark crystal that seemed to drink in the faint sunlight. Its hull stretched wide and sleek, etched with glowing green veins that pulsed like a heartbeat, a living machine born from the Empire's relentless ambition. The ship's edges curved with predatory grace, sharp yet seductive, a fortress designed not just to crush worlds, but to bend them to its will. As Logan stepped closer, escorted by a pair of Etherean guards, the cold wind carried a faint hum from the vessel, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through his boots. He tilted his head, green eyes narrowing as he took it in, hands still shoved deep in the pockets of his worn leather jacket. Nice ride, he muttered, smirking. Bit flashy for my taste. Seraphine led the way, her silhouette cutting through the haze of Zithra's ruins. Her liquid metal armor caught the green light spilling from the ship, turning her into a vision of silver and shadow, every step a quiet command. The armor clung to her like a lover's touch, outlining the impossible slimness of her waist, the gentle flare of her hips, the long, sculpted legs that peeked through slits in the design. Her white hair trailed behind her, shimmering like a river of glass under the ship's glow, and her violet eyes burned with a steady, unreadable fire. She didn't glance back, but the sway of her walk felt deliberate, a lure meant to draw every eye, and it did, except for one. Logan trailed her, his boots scuffing the broken ground, his posture loose and unbothered. Behind him, Zelenki scurried to keep up, his silver tendrils bouncing like a jester's cap, his oversized armor clanking with every frantic step. He clutched a small, buzzing device in his hands, muttering to himself about perfecting the ambience and showing this human who's boss. Logan shot him a sidelong glance, smirking. Careful with that toy, kid. Don't want you blowing us all up before the fun starts. They boarded the ship through a wide, arched entryway, the air shifting as they crossed the threshold. Inside, the ethereal veil was a marvel of alien design, Walls of translucent crystal lined the corridors, refracting the emerald light into kaleidoscope patterns that danced across the floor. The ceilings arched high, studded with glowing orbs that cast a soft, hypnotic haze, bathing everything in a greenish tint. The floors gleamed like polished obsidian, reflecting every movement in distorted, dreamlike echoes. It wasn't just a ship. It was a cathedral of control, a place where the Empire's power seeped into every corner, whispering promises of submission. Seraphine guided them deeper, her steps echoing faintly, the sound swallowed by the ship's vastness. The guards peeled off at her gesture, leaving her alone with Logan and Zelenki. She stopped at a chamber carved from solid crystal, its walls smooth and faintly warm, the green light pulsing stronger here, casting flickering shadows that played across her armor. The room was a cell, but it felt more like a stage, intimate, enclosed, a space where secrets could unravel. She turned to Logan, her violet eyes steady, voice slipping out like silk. "You should be craving me by now," she said, stepping closer. Her armor glinted as it hugged the curve of her waist, the metal shifting with her breath. She stopped just short of him, close enough for him to feel the heat radiating off her, that rich, warm scent teasing the air. Not just pheromones, but something uniquely hers, pulling at him like a quiet dare. Logan leaned back against the crystal wall, crossing his arms, that lopsided smirk firmly in place. "Kneeling's still not my thing," he said, voice casual but laced with a challenge. Her lips twitched, a flicker of something crossing her face, frustration, maybe, or the first hint of curiosity. She moved in, closing the distance, her body inches from his. One hand rose, fingers brushing his chest, tracing the worn leather of his jacket before sliding lower, pausing just above his belt. Her touch was light, deliberate, a slow burn that lingered in the air, promising more than it gave. "You'll bend," she murmured, violet eyes locking with his, daring him to prove her wrong. He didn't flinch. Instead, he pushed off the wall, stepping into her space, erasing the gap she'd left. His hand found her waist, fingers grazing the smooth metal where it dipped below her ribs, feeling the faint softness beneath the armor sheen. "You're getting warmer," he said, voice low and teasing, green eyes glinting with mischief. Then, in a swift move, he slid his hand lower, brushing the curve of her backside with a light, playful tap. She tensed, a sharp breath escaping her, violet eyes widening for a heartbeat before narrowing again. The air between them thickened, a spark flaring into something hotter, a quiet storm brewing just beneath the surface. Seraphine stepped back, but not before he caught the faint flush creeping up her cheeks, a crack in her regal mask. She turned, pacing a slow circle around him, her fingers trailing along the wall as if to steady herself. "You're bold, human," she said, her tone cool but threaded with something softer, something unsteady. Logan grinned, leaning back against the wall again. "Bold's my middle name." "Well, that and trouble." Before she could respond, Zelenki burst into the moment, waving his buzzing gadget like a madman. "My queen, I've got it. A pheromone sphere guaranteed to break him." He tripped over his own feet, the device slipping from his grasp. It hit the floor with a crack, shattering into a dozen pieces, and a thick, syrupy mist erupted, flooding the room. The scent was overwhelming, sweet, and heady, curling around them like a living thing, sinking into every breath. Seraphine swayed, her balance faltering, and stumbled forward, straight into Logan. His reflexes kicked in. He caught her, one arm hooking around her waist, the other hand landing firm on the swell of her hip. Her body pressed against his, soft and warm through the thin armor, her breath hitching as she steadied herself. She looked up, violet eyes meeting his, her lips parted just enough to draw his gaze. The mist amplified everything, the heat of her against him, the faint tremor in her frame, the way her scent wove through the haze, tugging at him low and deep. For a moment, they were locked there, her curves molded to his grip, her face so close he could feel her breath brush his skin. The room faded, leaving just the two of them, caught in a stillness that hummed with unspoken heat. "Nice catch," she whispered, voice barely audible, but she didn't pull away. Logan's grin softened, his hand sliding up her hip a fraction, fingers brushing the curve before letting go. "Told you I'd have to catch you again," he said, low and rough, green eyes holding hers with a flicker of something more. She straightened, stepping back, but the flush on her cheeks deepened, her composure fraying at the edges. Zelenki, oblivious to the moment, scrambled to his feet, shouting, "My queen, I've got another idea, a seductive dance routine." He launched into a ridiculous jig, arms flailing, tendrils bouncing wildly, his armor clanking with every awkward twist. He spun too fast, tripped over a loose panel, and crashed into the wall, his helmet clattering to the floor. He popped up, grinning sheepishly, silver tendrils tangled around his face. Maybe not that one," he mumbled. Seraphine sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. "Zelenki, stop before you break the ship." Logan laughed, a deep, rolling sound that echoed in the chamber. "Kid's got moves. Should have been a clown instead of a mad scientist." Seraphine's lips twitched, almost a smile, but she turned away, gesturing to the guards lingering at the door. "Leave us. I'll handle this one myself." The guards hesitated, exchanging glances, then filed out, their boots fading into the ship's hum. The door sealed behind them, leaving the cell quiet, the air still thick with that sweet, lingering mist. She faced him again, stepping close once more, her armor catching the green light in a way that made her glow. "Tell me, human," she said, her voice softer now, searching, almost unguarded. "What makes you so resistant?" Her hand hovered near his chest, not quite touching, but the warmth of it lingered, a silent question. Logan tilted his head, considering her, his smirk fading into something quieter, more real. "Back home, we've been tempted by worse. Ads, exes, late-night infomercials selling junk nobody needs. Desire's just noise if it's forced." His tone was light, but his eyes held hers, steady and piercing, cutting through the haze. She paused, violet gaze flickering, something shifting behind it. Doubt, maybe, or the first crack of wonder. Slowly, she reached out, her fingers brushing his jaw, tracing the rough line of his stubble with a touch so light it almost tickled. "And if it's not forced?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, like she was speaking to herself. Logan caught her wrist, his grip gentle but firm, his thumb grazing the inside of her palm, feeling the faint pulse there. "Then it's a choice," he said, voice dropping low, his other hand brushing her hip again, a fleeting touch that left a spark in its wake. She didn't pull back, her breath catching, and for the first time, she looked at him not as a queen commanding obedience, but as someone teetering on the edge of something new, something she couldn't name. The moment stretched, heavy and alive, until Zelenki's voice shattered it from the hall. "My queen, I've got a backup plan. Bigger sphere this time." Seraphine sighed, stepping away, her armor glinting as she slipped back into her regal mask. "We're not done, human," she said, turning to leave, her voice firm but threaded with a hint of promise. Logan smirked, watching her go, the sway of her hips drawing as I despite himself. "Looking forward to round two," he called after her, settling back against the wall. The ship hummed around him, a steady pulse that matched the slow burn in his chest. Whatever this was, it wasn't over, not by a long shot. The crystal cell aboard the ethereal veil shimmered with an otherworldly stillness, its walls glowing with a faint, pulsing green light that cast the room in a dreamlike haze. The chamber was a perfect cube, its surfaces smooth and flawless, carved from a single block of translucent crystal that seemed to breathe with a life of its own. The light danced across the walls, refracting into soft, shifting patterns that played tricks on the eye. Sometimes a ripple, sometimes a flicker, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a stone. The air hung warm and thick, laced with the lingering sweetness of Zelenki's shattered pheromone sphere, a cloying scent that clung to every corner like a stubborn shadow. It wasn't just a cell. It was a crucible, a space designed to strip away resistance and lay bare the soul. But Logan Vance stood at its center, untouched by its spell, a lone figure of defiance in a world built to bend. He leaned against one of the crystal walls, arms crossed over his chest, his green eyes glinting with a quiet, unshakable amusement. His leather jacket hung loose, scuffed, and weathered from 1,000 unseen battles, its dark brown a stark contrast to the alien gleam around him. The jacket's collar was up, framing his jaw, and his tousled brown hair caught the light in faint streaks, giving him a wild, untamed look that matched the lopsided smirk tugging at his lips. He looked out of place here, a rough-edged drifter dropped into a realm of polished perfection, but he wore that dissonance like armor. Unyielding, unbothered, a man who'd seen worse and walked away laughing. Seraphine paced before him, her movements restless yet graceful, a predator circling prey she couldn't quite pin down. Her liquid metal armor caught the green glow, turning her into a living silhouette of silver and shadow, the light playing across its surface like water over stone. The armor hugged her form with relentless precision, outlining the impossible slimness of her waist, the gentle flare of her hips, and the long, sculpted legs that peeked through its slits with every step. Her white hair swayed behind her, a cascade of glass threads that shimmered faintly in the haze, trailing down her back like a river of light. Her violet eyes burned with an intensity that hadn't dimmed since Zithra's fall, twin beacons of power and allure that could unravel a man with a glance. But beneath that regal facade, something flickered, a subtle tension, a fracture in her certainty that she couldn't mask, no matter how hard she tried. She stopped abruptly, turning to face him, her gaze locking onto his with a force that could have pinned a lesser man to the wall. "You defy me," she said, her voice low and smooth, threaded with a question she didn't dare voice aloud. "Why?" Logan shrugged, that smirk spreading wider, green eyes dancing with mischief. "Defying's just what I do when someone's trying too hard," he said, his tone light, but edged with steel, cutting through the haze like a blade through silk. He pushed off the wall, stepping closer, his boots scuffing the polished floor with a faint rasp that echoed in stillness. "You've got the whole pheromone gig down. Props for that. But it's not enough to make me drool like the rest of your fan club out there." His gaze flicked over her, lingering on the way her armor traced her curves, the metal gleaming as it hugged her waist and hips, before sliding back up to meet her eyes with a spark of challenge. "Takes more than fancy tricks to get under my skin." Her lips parted, a faint breath escaping as she processed his words, her violet eyes narrowing slightly. No one had ever spoken to her like this, casual, irreverent, as if her power was a cheap gimmick he'd seen through in a heartbeat. She stepped toward him, closing the gap, her body inches from his, the heat of her presence brushing against him like a whisper. That rich, warm scent of hers wove through the artificial sweetness, a thread of something uniquely her that tugged at something deep in his chest, low and unbidden. Her hand rose, fingers brushing his thigh, nails grazing the rough fabric of his pants in a slow, deliberate stroke that lingered like a promise half-spoken. "You should want me," she said, her voice dropping softer, almost searching, violet eyes flickering with a mix of command and curiosity, as if she were testing him and herself. Logan didn't flinch. He leaned in instead, his hand finding her waist, fingers pressing against the smooth metal where it dipped below her ribs. He felt the faint give beneath, the softness that belied her icy exterior, and his smirk widened into something warmer, more dangerous. "Want a funny thing," he said, voice low and rough, green eyes holding hers with a steady, piercing glint. "Takes more than a fancy suit and some magic air freshener to get me going." His hand slid lower, brushing the curve of her backside with a light, teasing tap, just enough to make her tense, violet eyes flaring wide for a split second before narrowing again. The air between them thickened, a heat flaring up that wasn't there before, a silent pull that hung heavy and alive, crackling like a storm waiting to break. She stepped back, but not before he caught the flush creeping up her cheeks, a rare slip in her armor she couldn't hide. "You're impossible," she muttered, turning away, her fingers trailing along the wall as if to steady herself. But she didn't retreat. She paced again, slower this time, her armor glinting with every turn, the green light playing across her form like a lover's touch. Logan watched, leaning back against the wall with a grin that refused to fade. "Impossible's my specialty," he said, crossing his arms again, his tone teasing but pointed. "You're welcome to keep trying, though. I'm enjoying the show. Great view from here." Her pacing faltered, and she shot him a look, violet eyes sharp but unsteady, a storm brewing behind them. Before she could reply, the chamber door slid open with a hiss, and Zelenki stumbled in, his silver tendrils bouncing wildly like a jester's bells gone haywire. He carried a small, glowing canister in his hands, its surface etched with alien runes that pulsed faintly blue, and his eyes gleamed with a frantic, almost unhinged excitement. "My queen, I perfected it," he shouted, his voice cracking as he waved the canister. A concentrated pheromone burst, 10 times stronger than the last one. "He'll be yours in seconds. Watch this." He tripped over his own feet, the canister slipping from his grasp mid-flail. It hit the floor with a sharp crack, shattering into a dozen pieces, and a dense, syrupy mist erupted, flooding the room with a force that pressed against the senses. The scent was overwhelming, thicker and sweeter than anything before, curling around them like a living thing, sinking into every breath with a dizzying weight. It wasn't just a smell, it was a presence, heavy and insistent, wrapping around the mind like a velvet glove laced with steel. Seraphine swayed, her balance faltering as the wave hit her, and she stumbled forward, her armor glinting wildly in the green light. Logan caught her, one arm hooking around her waist, the other hand landing firm on the swell of her hip. Her body pressed against his, soft and warm through the thin metal, her breath hitching as she steadied herself against his chest. She looked up, violet eyes meeting his, her lips parted just enough to draw his gaze, a faint tremble in her frame that she couldn't hide. The mist amplified everything, the heat of her against him, the way her curves molded to his grip, the rich scent of her weaving through the haze, tugging at him low and deep. For a moment, they were locked there, the world fading to nothing but the space where their bodies met, a stillness that thrummed with a raw, unspoken heat. "You're persistent," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the ship, but she didn't pull away. Logan's grin softened, his hand sliding up her hip a fraction, fingers brushing the curve before letting go with a reluctant ease. "And you're stubborn," he said, low and rough, green eyes holding hers with a flicker of something more, something that wasn't just defiance. "Guess we're a match made in chaos." She straightened, stepping back, but the flush on her cheeks deepened, her composure fraying further, violet eyes glinting with a storm she couldn't name, anger, intrigue, and maybe a whisper of something dangerously close to want. Zelenki scrambled to his feet, oblivious to the charged air between them, shouting, "My queen, it's working. Look at him. He trailed off, catching Logan's smirk and Seraphine's unsteady stance, his tendrils drooping slightly. "Or not," he mumbled, scratching his head with a sheepish grin. Seraphine shot him a glare, her voice sharp enough to cut through the mist. "Out, Zelenki. Now." He scurried off, tendrils jingling as he tripped over the threshold, muttering about tweaking the formula, as the door sealed behind him with a soft hiss. The chamber fell quiet again, the mist settling into a faint, lingering sweetness that clung to the air. Seraphine turned to Logan, her posture stiffening as she tried to reclaim her regal air, but the cracks were there, visible in the way her hands flexed at her sides. "You're kind," she said, her tone softer now, probing, almost unguarded. "What makes you resist? What drives you to stand when others fall?" She stepped closer, her hand hovering near his chest, not quite touching, but the warmth of it lingered, a a silent question in the space between them. Logan tilted his head, considering her, his smirk fading into something quieter, more real, his green eyes steady and piercing through the haze. "We've seen worse back home," he said, voice low and even, like he was recounting a story over a drink. "Greed that'll chew you up, heartbreak that leaves you hollow, promises that turn to dust the second you reach for him. Desire's just a cheap trick if it's forced. Takes more than that to move me, to make me feel anything worth a damn." He paused, leaning in slightly, his voice dropping lower. "Choice, though, that's the real kicker. That's what keeps a man standing when the world's trying to knock him down." His words hung there, simple but heavy, cutting through the artificial fog with a clarity that made her breath catch. Her violet eyes flickered, something shifting behind them. Doubt, wonder, a crack in the certainty she'd worn like a crown for centuries. Slowly, she reached out, her fingers brushing his jaw, tracing the rough line of his stubble with a touch so light it almost tickled, her nails grazing his skin like a whisper. "And what do you choose?" she asked, her voice barely above a breath, like she was testing the words, tasting them for the first time. Logan caught her wrist, his grip gentle but firm, his thumb grazing the inside of her palm, feeling the faint pulse beneath her skin. "Depends," he said, voice dropping low and rough, his other hand brushing her hip again, a fleeting touch that left a spark in its wake, warm and alive. "What's on the table, Queen?" She didn't pull back, her breath catching, and for the first time, she looked at him not as a ruler demanding submission, but as someone caught off guard, teetering on the edge of something raw and uncharted. The moment stretched, heavy and electric, until a commotion erupted outside the cell, shattering the silence. Voices, her soldiers, filtered through the crystal walls, low and urgent, their words carrying a weight that made her stiffen. "Why doesn't he crave her?" one muttered, his tone laced with confusion. "She's the queen. Everyone falls to her." Another voice, hesitant, replied, Maybe craving's not everything. Maybe there's more." A third chimed in, quieter, "He's not even shaking." "How's he doing that?" Seraphine's head snapped toward the door, her hand dropping from Logan's face, her violet eyes narrowing as the whispers grew louder, a ripple spreading through her ranks like a stone dropped in still water. Logan smirked, leaning back against the wall, his tone teasing but pointed. "Sounds like your crew's starting to think for themselves," he said, green eyes glinting with amusement. "Tough day for the pheromone business, huh?" She glared at him, but the fire in her eyes wavered, softened by something she couldn't shake, something his words had stirred, something she hadn't felt in centuries. The whispers outside grew into a low murmur, a chorus of doubt and curiosity that echoed through the ship, and she turned away, pacing again, her armor glinting with every restless step. Logan watched, his grin fading into a quieter certainty, knowing he'd planted a seed, one that was already taking root, spreading beyond the cell, beyond her control. The game had shifted, and the stakes were climbing higher with every breath. The interrogation chamber aboard the ethereal veil loomed like a cathedral of alien design, its vastness dwarfing even the tension that filled it. The walls rose high, carved from seamless crystal that shimmered with an inner life, their surfaces etched with faint, glowing runes that pulsed in time with the ship's heartbeat. Green light spilled from orbs embedded in the arched ceiling, casting a misty haze that softened the room's edges, turning sharp lines into ghostly shadows. The floor stretched out like a dark mirror, polished to a flawless sheen, reflecting every movement in distorted, dreamlike echoes that danced beneath the feet of those who stood upon it. The air hung heavy, thick with the faint, cloying sweetness of Zelenki's earlier pheromone mishap, a stubborn remnant that clung to the crystal, the walls, the very breath of the room. At the chamber's heart stood a low, circular platform, its surface inlaid with alien glyphs that glowed a soft blue, their hum a quiet vibration that thrummed through the space like a living pulse. This wasn't just a room. It was a stage, a crucible forged to break the defiant and crown the submissive, a testament to Ethereum's unyielding power. Logan Vance stood atop that platform, hands shoved deep in the pockets of his battered leather jacket, green eyes glinting with a quiet, unshakable defiance that turned the chamber's purpose upside down. His jacket hung loose, scuffed and weathered, its dark brown a stark contrast to the pristine alien tech around him. But he wore it like a second skin, unapologetic, unbowed. His tousled brown hair caught the green light in faint streaks, giving him a wild, reckless edge that matched the lopsided smirk tugging at his lips. He looked out of place here, a rough-edged drifter dropped into a world of polished perfection. But that dissonance was his strength, a man who'd faced worse and walked away grinning, untouched by the weight of expectation pressing down on him. Seraphine stood before him, her presence a force that filled the room, her liquid metal armor catching the light in a mesmerizing dance of silver and shadow. The armor clung to her with relentless precision, outlining the impossible slimness of her waist, the gentle flare of her hips, and the long, sculpted legs that peeked through its slits with every measured step. Her white hair flowed down her back, shimmering like a river of glass in the hazy green glow, trailing behind her like a living veil. Her violet eyes burned with a storm of emotions, authority, frustration, and something deeper, something uncharted that flickered beneath her regal mask. She stood mere feet away, her boots clicking against the mirrored floor, the sound sharp and deliberate in the stillness. But the cracks in her composure were widening, etched in the way her fingers flexed at her sides, the way her breath caught when she met his gaze, a queen teetering on the edge of something she couldn't control. Around them, a dozen Etherean soldiers lined the walls, their armor gleaming under the green light, their faces hidden behind visors that reflected the room in cold, metallic glints. Their presence was meant to enforce her will, a silent legion of loyalty, but their murmurs low, insistent, filtered through the haze, a chorus of doubt that had followed her from the crystal cell. "He's still standing," one whispered, his voice muffled but sharp. "She's the queen. Why isn't he on his knees?" Another, quieter. "Maybe the pheromones don't work on him." The words hung in the air, a ripple of unease spreading through their ranks, and Seraphine's head tilted slightly, her violet eyes narrowing as she caught the sound, though she kept her focus on Logan. "Why don't you crave me, human?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with an edge, a question that carried the weight of centuries of unchallenged rule. She stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate, the heat of her presence brushing against him like a whisper. That rich, warm scent of hers wove through the lingering sweetness, a thread of something uniquely her that tugged at something low in his chest, unbidden and deep. Her hand rose, fingers brushing his chest, tracing the worn leather of his jacket in a slow, deliberate stroke that lingered like a promise half-spoken. "You stand here, untouched, while my empire bends to my will. What makes you different?" Logan tilted his head, that lopsided smirk spreading across his face, green eyes dancing with a mischief that refused to fade. "Difference, one word for it," he said, his tone light but cutting, a blade wrapped in velvet that sliced through the haze. He stepped off the platform, closing the gap between them, his boots scuffing the mirrored floor with a casual rasp that echoed in the stillness. "Your empire's got the bells and whistles, shiny ship, fancy air juice, but I've seen worse temptations than you on a slow Tuesday back home. Desire's a trick, sweetheart. Works like a charm till someone decides it's just smoke and mirrors." His hand found her waist, fingers pressing against the smooth metal where it dipped below her ribs, feeling the faint softness beneath the armor sheen. "Me? I choose when to feel it, and when to walk away." Her violet eyes flared, a spark of something, anger, intrigue, maybe both, lighting them up, but she didn't pull away. She leaned in, her body inches from his, her breath warm against his jaw, a faint tremor in her frame that she couldn't hide. "And what do you feel now?" she murmured, her voice dropping low, almost a challenge, her fingers sliding up to his shoulder, nails grazing the leather in a slow, teasing stroke. Logan's smirk widened, his hand sliding lower, brushing the curve of her backside with a light, playful tap, just enough to make her tense, violet eyes widening for a heartbeat before narrowing again. The air between them thickened, a heat flaring up that crackled like a live wire, a silent pull that hung heavy and alive, humming with a raw, unspoken energy. "Getting warmer," he said, voice rough and low, green eyes holding hers with a steady, piercing glint. "But I'm still standing, your move." She stepped back, but not before he caught the flush creeping up her cheeks, a crack in her regal mask she couldn't mask. "You mock me," she said, her tone sharp but unsteady, turning away to pace the platform's edge. Her armor glinted with every step, the green light playing across her form like a lover's touch. But her movements were restless, her hands clenching and unclenching as if wrestling with something inside. The soldier's whispers grew louder, a tide of unease swelling in the room. "He's not kneeling," one muttered, his voice carrying a hint of awe. "How's he resisting her?" Another, quieter, "Maybe she's not as strong as we thought. Maybe none of this is." Seraphine's head snapped toward them, her violet eyes narrowing into slits, but the doubt in their voices mirrored the storm brewing within her, a tempest she couldn't silence. Before she could lash out, the chamber door slid open with a sharp hiss, and Zelenki burst in, his silver tendrils bouncing wildly like a jester's bells gone rogue. He carried a contraption that defied description, a mechanical monstrosity with twitching limbs, adorned with glowing orbs that pulsed erratically in red and blue, its frame creaking as it wobbled forward. "My queen," he shouted, his voice cracking with manic glee. "I've got it, the ultimate seduction weapon, a dancing robot to break him once and for all." He tripped over a loose cable, the robot lurching into motion, its arms flailing as it spun across the room. It twirled with absurd abandon, hips gyrating in a ridiculous parody of allure, its orbs flashing in a chaotic rhythm that lit the chamber like a deranged disco. The soldiers stared, visors tilting, their murmurs turning to stifled laughs. One coughed to cover a snort, another whispered, "Is that supposed to work?" Seraphine glared at Zelenki, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Stop that thing now!" But it was too late. The robot spun too fast, its leg catching on the platform's edge, and it toppled forward with a metallic screech, crashing into her full force. She stumbled, her balance lost, and pitched toward Logan, her armor glinting wildly in the green light. He caught her, one arm hooking around her waist, the other hand landing firm on the swell of her hip, fingers brushing the curve of her backside as he steadied her. Her body pressed against his, soft and warm through the thin metal, her breath hitching as she gripped his shoulders for support. She looked up, violet eyes meeting his, her lips parted just enough to draw his gaze, a faint tremble in her frame that she couldn't hide. The robot clattered to the floor behind her, sparking and twitching in a heap of twisted limbs, but neither noticed. The world shrank to the space where their bodies met, a heat flaring sharp and undeniable, a spark that burned through the haze. "You okay, Queen?" he asked, voice low and rough, his hand lingering on her hip, fingers tracing the curve before easing off with a reluctant slowness. She didn't pull away, her breath warm against his jaw, violet eyes searching his with a storm of emotions, shock, frustration, and something rawer, deeper, that flickered like a flame caught in the wind. "You," she whispered, but the words faltered, lost in the pull between them, her hands tightening on his shoulders for a heartbeat longer than necessary. The soldiers' whispers turned to stunned silence, their visors fixed on the scene, and for a moment, time held its breath, the chamber's hum the only sound in the stillness. Zelenki scrambled to his feet, shouting over the wreckage, "My queen, I'm sorry. It was supposed to seduce him, not tackle you." Logan cut him off with a laugh, a deep, rolling sound that echoed off the crystal walls. "Nice try, kid," he said, green eyes glinting with amusement. "Stick to juggling, better odds of not breaking her." Seraphine straightened, stepping back, but the flush on her cheeks deepened, her composure fraying at the edges like a tapestry unraveling thread by thread. She turned to the soldiers, her voice firm but strained, carrying an edge of exhaustion. "Leave us, all of you." They hesitated, visors tilting toward one another, then filed out, their murmurs trailing behind them like a retreating tide. He caught her again. She didn't push him away. "What's happening to us?" The door sealed with a soft hiss, leaving the chamber quiet, the green light pulsing faintly overhead. Seraphine faced Logan, her posture stiffening as she tried to reclaim her authority. But her violet eyes betrayed her. Doubt, wonder, a crack in the certainty she'd wielded like a weapon for centuries. "Why don't you crave me, human?" she asked again, stepping closer, her hand hovering near his chest, the warmth of it lingering like a ghost. "What makes you immune when my power has broken worlds, shattered kings, bent armies?" Her voice trembled slightly, a rare vulnerability slipping through the cracks. Logan tilted his head, his smirk fading into something quieter, more real, green eyes steady and piercing through the haze. "Because desire works till someone chooses not to feel it," he said, voice low and even, like he was laying out a simple truth over campfire. "You've got the tech, the looks, the whole damn package. Hell, I'd be lying if I said it didn't tempt me, didn't stir something down deep. But I've walked away from worse, greed, heartbreak, lies that promise the world and leave you empty. I choose what's real, not what's forced." He stepped into her space, his hand finding her waist again, fingers pressing against the metal, feeling the faint give beneath. "You're real enough to make it tough, though," he added, his voice dropping lower, his hand sliding up to brush the curve of her hip, a touch that left a spark in its wake, warm and alive. She didn't pull back, her breath catching, violet eyes locking with his, and for the first time, she felt it. Powerlessness, not from defeat, but from something she couldn't bend to her will. The weight of his words sank in, heavy and unyielding, and she turned away, pacing the platform again, her armor glinting with every restless step. The soldier's whispers echoed in her mind. Maybe there's more. Maybe craving's not everything. Their doubt a mirror to her own, a reflection she couldn't escape. She stopped, her back to him, her voice barely audible, a murmur to herself. "Choice," she said, tasting the word like it was a foreign spice, bitter and sweet. She turned, violet eyes meeting his, and for a moment, she was no queen, just a woman standing on the edge of a precipice, staring into an abyss she'd never dared to face. "You've undone me, human," she said, her tone soft but resolute, a confession she hadn't meant to voice. "And them." Logan smirked, leaning back against the platform, his posture loose but his eyes sharp. "Wasn't my plan," he said, green eyes glinting with a mix of amusement and something warmer. "But I'll take the credit. Happy to help." She stared at him, her violet gaze steady, a decision crystallizing behind it, hard-earned and unshakable. She raised her voice, calling out to the empty chamber, "Zelenki." The advisor poked his head in, tendrils drooping, his ruined robot smoking behind him like a fallen soldier. "Yes, my queen," he squeaked, his voice trembling with nervous hope. "Enough," she said, her tone final, cutting through the air like a decree carved in stone. "No more weapons, no more tricks. Return to the court. Be the fool you were meant to be. Bring laughter to my people, not this chaos." Zelenki blinked, then grinned wide, bowing so low his tendrils brushed the floor. "As you command, my queen. Laughter it is." He scurried off, leaving a trail of sparks and a faint jingle in his wake. Seraphine faced Logan, her violet eyes steady, a weight lifting from her shoulders as she spoke. "The campaign ends here," she said, her voice ringing clear. "No more worlds will fall to this trick. We build anew, by choice, not force." Logan nodded, his smirk softening into something warmer, a quiet respect flickering in his green eyes. "Good call," he said, stepping closer, his hand brushing her hip one last time, a fleeting touch that sealed the shift between them, light but deliberate. "Let's see where real takes us. Might be fun." She didn't pull away, her breath steadying, And for the first time in centuries, she felt the weight of a choice. Not forced, not demanded, but hers alone. The chamber hummed around them, a witness to the turning tide, and beyond its walls, an empire waited to be remade. The deck of the ethereal veil stretched wide and open beneath an endless canopy of stars, a vast expanse of dark crystal that gleamed like polished obsidian under the cosmic glow. The ship had lifted off from Zithra's broken surface hours ago, leaving behind the shattered spires and pheromone-soaked ruins, now little more than a fading scar on the planet below. Up here, high above the wreckage, the air was crisp and clean, stripped of the cloying sweetness that had once been the Empire's signature weapon. The green light that pulsed through the vessel's veins softened to a gentle hum, spilling from the deck's edges in faint, glowing streaks that traced the crystal like rivers of life, winding through a barren land. The stars burned bright overhead, a tapestry of white and silver stitched against the infinite black, their light reflecting off the ship's hull in shimmering streaks that danced across its surface. The view was breathtaking, a silent testament to the universe's vastness, a canvas of possibility that stretched beyond the horizon. This wasn't just a deck. It was a vantage point, a place to stand and see not just the past wreckage, but the fragile, flickering promise of what could come next. Logan Vance stood near the deck's edge, hands shoved deep in the pockets of his battered leather jacket, green eyes fixed on the starfield with a calm, steady gaze that held no trace of the chaos he'd walked through. His brown hair ruffled faintly in the artificial breeze generated by the ship's systems, strands catching the starlight in soft, unruly streaks that gave him a wild, untamed look. The jacket hung loose on his frame, scuffed and weathered from battles unseen, its dark brown a stark contrast to the pristine alien tech surrounding him. A faint tear ran along one sleeve, a scar from some forgotten fight, but he wore it with the same easy confidence that had carried him through Zithra's fall. Unapologetic, unbothered, a man who'd stare down worse than an empire's collapse and come out smirking. He leaned against a low railing, one boot propped up on its base, his lopsided smirk tugging at his lips as he took in the view. Not just the stars, but the shift in the air, the quiet hum of something ending and something new beginning to take its place. Seraphine stood beside him, her silhouette a striking figure against the starlit void, her liquid metal armor catching the celestial glow in a mesmerizing dance of silver and shadow. The armor clung to her with relentless precision, outlining the impossible slimness of her waist, the gentle flare of her hips, and the long, sculpted legs that peeked through its slits with every subtle shift. The metal shimmered as she breathed, a living thing that moved with her, accentuating the grace of her form under the starlight's caress. Her white hair flowed down her back, a cascade of glass threads that caught the light like a river of molten silver, swaying gently in the breeze as if alive. Her violet eyes, once fierce with the fire of command, now softened with a quiet, unguarded wonder, reflecting the stars above in twin pools of light that shimmered with a depth she'd hidden for centuries. She stood close to Logan, closer than she'd ever allowed before, her posture relaxed but deliberate, her hands resting lightly at her sides. For the first time in ages, her face broke into a smile, a small, genuine curve of her lips that softened her sharp features, stripping away the weight of her crown to reveal the woman beneath, a queen stepping into a role she'd chosen, not one forced upon her by destiny. The deck wasn't silent or empty. Etherean soldiers milled about, their armor glinting faintly under the starlight as they moved in loose, unhurried clusters. Their visors were raised now, exposing faces, some humanoid, some alien, a mix of sharp angles and soft curves that spoke of an empire woven from countless worlds. They no longer stood rigid with the blind loyalty of old. Their steps were lighter, their voices carrying a hum of conversation that rose and fell like a tide. Some leaned against the railings, staring out at the stars with expressions of quiet awe. Others gathered in small groups, exchanging words and soft laughter, their hands gesturing freely in a way that spoke of newfound ease. Near the center of the deck, Zelenki capered about, a whirlwind of motion and sound, his silver tendrils bouncing wildly as he performed for a growing crowd. He'd shed his clanking armor for a jester's motley. Bright patches of red and blue stitched together in a chaotic swirl, the fabric flapping as he moved, his tendrils jingling with tiny bells that rang with every exaggerated leap. He juggled glowing orbs, tossing them high into the air with a flourish, catching them with a dramatic spin as he shouted, "Behold, the great Zelenki, bringer of joy to the stars." The soldiers laughed, a warm, rolling sound that carried across the deck, some clapping, others calling out playful jibes. "Don't drop him again, fool." And Zelenki grinned wider, bowing low with a theatrical sweep of his arm. Logan glanced at Seraphine, green eyes glinting with amusement as he nodded towards Zelenki's antics. "Looks like the kid finally found his calling," he said, his tone light but warm, a thread of approval woven through it. "Better than blowing stuff up. Less cleanup for the rest of us." Seraphine tilted her head, her violet gaze following his, and she nodded, her voice soft but steady, carrying a note of quiet satisfaction. "He was wasted on machines," she said, her smile widening slightly as she watched Zelenki tumble into a clumsy somersault, drawing another burst of laughter from the crowd. "Laughter suits him. It suits us all now. A better tool than fear or force ever was." She turned back to Logan, her smile lingering, a rare warmth in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a spark of something new kindled by the choice she'd made in that crystal chamber, a choice to let go, to build anew. They stood in silence for a moment, the hum of the ship and the distant jingle of Zelenki's bells weaving a quiet backdrop to the starlit scene. The breeze brushed against them, cool and steady, carrying the faint hum of the ship's engines far below. Then Logan shifted, stepping closer, his hand brushing her waist, fingers pressing against the smooth metal where it dipped below her ribs. He felt the faint give beneath, the softness that belied her armor's sheen, and his smirk softened into something warmer, more real, green eyes holding hers with a steady, piercing glint. "You're smiling," he said, voice low and rough, a note of surprise threading through it. "First time I've seen that. Looks damn good on you, Queen." His hand slid lower, brushing the curve of her hip with a light, teasing touch, just enough to make her breath catch, violet eyes flickering with a mix of surprise and something deeper, a warmth that lingered in the space between them. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into the touch, her hand rising to rest on his chest, fingers tracing the worn leather of his jacket in a slow, deliberate stroke that mirrored his own. "It's been centuries," she murmured, her voice soft, almost a confession, her violet eyes searching his with a quiet intensity. "I've forgotten what it felt like, to choose joy, to feel it without forcing it from others." Her fingers lingered, nails grazing the fabric, and she stepped closer, her body inches from his, the heat of her presence brushing against him like a whisper across bare skin. That rich, warm scent of hers filled the air, free of the artificial taint of pheromones, tugging at something low in his chest, a pull that wasn't demanded but invited, alive and real in the space where their breaths mingled. Logan's smirk widened, his hand sliding up her hip, fingers brushing the curve before settling there with a gentle firmness that spoke of intent. "Guess I'm a bad influence," he said, voice rough and playful, green eyes glinting with mischief as he leaned in slightly. "Bringing out the rebel in you. Next thing you know, you'll be cracking jokes with Zelenki and stealing my gig." She laughed, a soft, melodic sound that rolled off her lips like a song, the first true laugh he'd heard from her, and it lit her face with a warmth that made the stars above seem pale in comparison. "Perhaps," she said, her tone teasing, her hand sliding up to his shoulder, resting there as she met his gaze with a spark of playfulness. "Or perhaps you've shown me something worth keeping, something I didn't know I'd lost." The air between them thickened, a heat flaring up that hummed with a quiet, unspoken energy, a spark kindled not by tricks or force but by something real, something chosen. He leaned in closer, his other hand brushing her thigh, fingers grazing the smooth metal in a fleeting touch that left a spark in its wake, warm and alive. "Worth keeping, huh?" he murmured, voice dropping low, his lips close enough to brush her ear if he chose, the roughness of his tone sending a shiver through the air. "Careful, Queen. You might start liking me, and then where'd we be?" She didn't pull back, her breath steadying, violet eyes locking with his. And for a moment, they were alone amidst the stars, the deck and its clamor fading to nothing but the space where their bodies met, a closeness that felt as vast as the void above. Zelenki's voice broke the stillness, piercing the moment with a shout from the center of the deck. "My queen, my lord of chaos, behold my grand finale." He launched into a wild dance, spinning and leaping with reckless abandon, his bells jingling in a chaotic rhythm that rang across the deck. He twirled too fast, tripped over his own feet, and tumbled into a heap with a dramatic flourish, arms splayed wide as if he'd planned it all along. The soldiers roared with laughter, clapping as he popped up, grinning wide, his tendrils tangled around his face in a silver mess. "Perfection," he declared, bowing low to another wave of cheers. Logan chuckled, a deep, rolling sound that echoed across the deck, and Seraphine's laugh joined his, softer but bright, a harmony that carried over the hum of the ship and the jingle of bells. "He's a walking disaster," Logan said, green eyes glinting with amusement, his hand still resting on her hip, fingers brushing the curve with a light, lingering touch. "But he's your disaster now." She nodded, her smile softening into something warmer, her hand sliding down to rest on his arm, fingers brushing the leather with a gentle, deliberate stroke. "Ours," she corrected, her voice steady, violet eyes warm with a quiet resolve that anchored the moment. "This empire, it's ours to remake, together, not by force but by will." She stepped closer, her body brushing against his, the heat of her presence a steady flame that didn't demand but invited, a choice shared in the press of her form against his. Logan's smirk faded into something quieter, more real, his hand tightening on her hip for a heartbeat before easing off with a reluctant slowness. "Together, huh?" he said, voice low and warm, green eyes holding hers with a flicker of something deeper. Respect, maybe, or the start of something neither could name yet. "I can work with that." Beats going solo. The deck hummed beneath them, its crystal surface alive with the faint pulse of the ship, and the stars stretched out in an endless promise, a canvas of light and shadow that mirrored the shift unfolding below. The soldiers' laughter mingled with Zelenki's antics, a new rhythm for a new era, a sound that carried hope where once there'd been only control. The ethereal veil, once a weapon of conquest forged in cold ambition, now stood as a symbol of something else. Loyalty earned through trust, strength built through choice, a vessel remade as surely as the empire it carried. Seraphine turned to face the stars, her shoulder brushing Logan's, a subtle contact that spoke volumes, and he stood beside her, green eyes fixed on the horizon with a quiet certainty. His hand found hers, fingers brushing her palm in a light, deliberate touch that lingered, tracing the lines of her skin before settling there with a gentle firmness. It wasn't a command, not a trick, but a choice shared between them, a silent pact sealed under the starlight. "Not a bad view," he said, his voice carrying a promise of its own, rough but warm, his smirk returning softer now, tempered by the moment. "Not a bad start either." She nodded, her hand tightening on his arm, violet eyes reflecting the stars with a quiet triumph, a spark of joy she hadn't known she could claim. As Zelenki launched into another absurd routine, tumbling into a soldier and sending them both laughing to the deck in a tangle of limbs and bells, Seraphine's smile held, a steady light in her violet gaze. Logan glanced at her, his smirk softening further, green eyes warm with a flicker of something new, something worth chasing. "Let's see where this ride takes us," he said, his voice low, a thread of anticipation woven through it. "Might be one hell of a trip." She turned to him, her hand resting on his chest again, fingers brushing the leather with a light, lingering touch, and she nodded, her voice steady and sure. "Together," she said, and the stars bore witness as they faced the void, a new journey unfolding, one built on something real, something chosen, something theirs.